there's a very, very high probability that your son is never going to go to college. There's a lot of brainwashing that's happened over the past couple of decades.
Gen Z's pivot from college to blue-collar jobs, from student debt to the rise in AI.
But let's say you have a 12-year-old kid who's a smart enough kid. This is just not kind of how his mind works. You can make a lot of money, for example, as a welder.
Automation is going to replace many of those jobs.
Every time you've had substantial technology shifts, you have had certain types of jobs go away, and yet overall prosperity significantly accelerated for that time frame. All of those things will create a tremendous number of jobs. China's going to do it. China is doing it. We have to figure these things out along the way, but we don't have a choice as to whether or not we do them.
We talked about the fact that the private markets are growing in comparison to the public markets. How much of that is a response to the regulatory burdens of being a public company? And if the administration were to reduce some of those burdens, do you see more access to good public companies coming to the average investor?
I do. I think it's not just more IPOs. I think it's also more M&A transactions. HSR is a huge burden. Hart-Scott-Rodino, a lot of people will talk to you about that, I'm sure. The IPO process itself, the SEC under the previous administration was extremely difficult in a lot of different ways. I know a lot of the crypto people that listen to your podcast probably were not big Gary Gensler fans. I can assure them that it doesn't stop at crypto. There were a lot of other things the SEC was doing that made all sorts of transactions problematic and difficult, really for no good reason. I sort of half joke that what the SEC has managed to accomplish in many ways over the past 50 years or whatever is to preclude retail investors from participating and investing in a lot of great companies. You've got rules like, qualified purchaser rules, QIB rules, stuff like this. So a lot of that stuff might have noble intentions, but like a lot of things with noble intentions, the actual implementation of these things, it really is counterproductive in many different ways. So I would love to see a lot of regulatory relief on the going public process, the IPO process, the ability for companies to merge and create value in this way. I mean, there's a lot of things that have been held up in terms of potential mergers that have been held up with things like HSR, things like antitrust for companies that have, in my opinion at least, no real antitrust angle whatsoever. I mean, in some cases, it's companies merging not from a position of strength necessarily, but basically from an idea of how do you survive. And the mergers are being held up or in some cases blocked. So again, going back to our broader theme that we were talking about earlier on nuclear and other things, I think and believe and hope certainly that the footing of this administration is going to be, we need to have some regulations. Everyone understands that. But what we've done across a variety of agencies in the federal government for many, many years now has not been productive regulation. It's been strangling ourselves.
My background's in the oil and gas industry, and we saw a tremendous shift in our relationship with the capital markets with the ESG requirements. And they started treating companies like ours that produce oil, they started treating it almost like the tobacco industry, or like it was like something that you had to have in a black bag and carry with shame if you were to invest in. And we're starting to see a little bit of pullback in with regards to ESG. Where do you see that heading?
Well, my personal view, for what it's worth, and certainly my hope, is that ESG will fall into roughly the same category as DEI. Both of these things, at least from my experience watching this stuff over the past several years, both of these things almost sort of magically appeared. All of a sudden, ESG was a tremendously important thing. All of a sudden, DEI was a tremendously important thing. And in both cases, you had a lot of policies as they were implemented that, for lack of a better term, at least in my view, were very much against the American way. So there was tremendous discrimination, that was created both in terms of individuals as well as companies. There were a lot of arbitrary rules that were created. For example, the way that they calculate carbon production or carbon footprint is a very one-sided and also a very incomplete calculation. So if you look at a wind farm, for example, they're only calculating based on the output. There's no calculation on what it actually takes to construct these things, what it takes to maintain them, what are some of the other challenges that are created. A lot of people like to talk about the whale population, for example. So it's just a very incomplete calculation. And so I think this, again, kind of all falls into the same broad category of we're going to be a real country again, and we're going to pioneer things the way that we used to. We're going to take these technological advances that we have and actually put them into production. And we're going to do smart regulation, and we're not going to do things that are dangerous. And that's the other thing. A lot of these things are all, at least to me, are almost sort of silly. Companies have no long-term vested interest in building unsafe products. No company thinks that that's a good business strategy. So again, this goes back to this partnership idea that I hope starts to proliferate between companies and the various agencies that regulate them. We're in this together. We're trying to get this across the board, over the process as quickly as we can, as safe as we can. We all have the same vested interests, and rather than playing traffic cop as a regulator, let's be almost partners in this endeavor to bring this technology to the American people.
I know you're a parent. I'm a parent as well. And we're kind of on this precipice of how do we prepare our children to advance themselves in this new world. And we have seen a lot of, I guess, ineffective education that I feel like has cursed the last two generations. If you are talking to parents on and young people on how to educate themselves and how to get them prepared for this new world that we're going to be living in, what do you tell them to do as far as education, as far as, we used to fight real hard for the best internship. What do people do moving forward to put themselves in a position to prosper with this changing landscape?
So I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it partially depends. I mean, there's a overall overarching answer to this, I think, but in terms of tactics, I think it partially depends on how old your kids are. So, for example, I have a friend I grew up with whose son is like 12 years old or something, and I keep telling him, I think that there's a very, very high probability that your son is never going to go to college, and I think that there's a lot of value to that, frankly, because there's a lot of brainwashing that's happened over the past couple of decades. We can see it in campuses today. There's a lot of non-productive things being learned. And in many cases, there's a significant amount of debt being built up. It's going to be very difficult to pay off if you have the wrong type of major that has really no job utility. So I think for someone who's 12 years old, I told him, you should be thinking of two distinct paths. One is, let's just be honest. If you have a high achieving, entrepreneurial, very intelligent, self-taught type of child, that child should be completely immersed in all things AI. And the beautiful thing about the world today is so much of this can be self-taught. These models are public. A lot of these agents are public. A lot of other tools are public in terms of learning about these things. Ilya, for example, does like 3.5-hour videos. He's done several of them on YouTube. They give you a tremendous amount of information on how these models are built, how these models can be used. I'm always on X or Twitter, following various accounts to keep as close to the metal as I can on day-to-day developments in AI. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was just reading something yesterday. I remember a year and a half, 2 years ago, when RAGs came out. When RAGs, at least when I first started looking at RAGs. Retrieval augmented generation, that was sort of a very interesting innovation, at least from my perspective. Now I'm reading more and more about how various companies like Claude, for example, are moving away from RAGs because they think there's ways to do it agentically that are superior in many ways. So it's a constant struggle, if you will, even as an adult, to stay as close to the cutting edge as you can. And so for a child, this is all, you're going to be essentially native as a 12-year-old. My boy's 5. He's absolutely going to be native, in my opinion. So it's going to be skills like knowing how to prompt, knowing how to manipulate the output that you're looking for from these various models, knowing how to use various agents. I think that's going to be tremendously important. And when you start to think about college, I've said to my friends, I think a lot of my friends agree with me, and we probably agree with each other, what's the purpose of having various professors with all sorts of their own flaws and biases and things of this nature? Maybe they're super smart, maybe they're not. When you know for a fact, if you're using some of these tools, you're talking to PhD plus level intelligence, and you're being able to, I think there'll be some supervision if you can hopefully afford some kind of tutor or something I think that'll be very important. But some type of supervised learning with the child to navigate these tools, I believe, is going to be the way that education moves. Certainly college, maybe if you're young enough, it might even start to include high school. There's obviously sort of social development, so sports and things like this, I think will be important. But let's say you have a 12-year-old kid who's, a smart enough kid, but he's not going to, this is just not kind of how his mind works. I think this country is going to, especially as this reindustrialization starts to take shape and starts to accelerate, you can make a lot of money, for example, as a welder. I mean, we need to get back to not just trade schools, but almost like apprenticeship models. And a lot of those businesses, not only can you make good money as a starting point, as say a welder or an electrician or whatever, but over time in a small community or a medium-sized community, you might be able to build up a business that does these things, like an HVAC business or an electrician business. So I think that's kind of if you ask my view right now, I think those are the ways to be thinking. When I was going through high school, pretty much myself and all the people that I knew, everyone was thinking about where they were going to go to college. I think that kids, call it 12 and under, it's going to be a very, very different thought process. And I think it's going to be, is my best use case being some type of expert in a field like, say, welding, or is my use case more of an entrepreneurial thing where I'm going to essentially train myself with some supervised help on how to be AI native?
As young people and seasoned investors are moving forward, and you have these pre-revenue businesses which are going to fundamentally change our society, what metrics do you use to look at them, and how do you compare them to one another to determine which one is the plum in the pudding?
So I think it's a few things. So I'll use Joby as an example. I'm speaking as an investor here, not as a board member. So when we first looked at Joby, we built what's best described as a discounted cash flow model. And so building a discounted cash flow model is obviously just a matter of inputting various inputs into an Excel spreadsheet and then basically playing around with those assumptions. But in order to build something like that, a number of different questions have to be answered beforehand, some of which are qualitative in some ways. So I use the term table stakes again. The thought process was, this is far and away the leader in this industry. This industry will actually come true, so to speak. The biggest concern, challenge that I had looking at this, as I was alluding to earlier, was how to think about the regulatory process. And so one thing that I'll say about my experience doing the underwriting on this several years ago now, we look at the competitive market. We talk to a variety of experts. Some of those are engineers, physics experts. Elon's got this great line that I think is wonderful. If the physics work, now it's just a function of probabilities. In other words, it can be done. We know it can be done. It's just a function of the probabilities of this company actually pulling it off. So we came to the conclusion that the physics on the existing aircraft that's being certified today, those physics work. And they result in the parameters, the specifications, the qualifications that I was talking about earlier, the range, the noise, the payload, things of that nature. So you have a product that works. The regulatory process is challenging, but we were able to come to a view that this will get certified. And to do that, again, you're talking to a lot of different types of experts. You're talking to not just engineers, but in this case, regulatory experts, et cetera. And I've done this over the years with a number of different companies pursuing truly innovative technologies. And one of the challenges, at least that I've had doing this type of work, is you'll talk to expert A and they'll say, well, here's why this is so great. Here's why this is the way to approach this, et cetera, et cetera. And you as sort of a layman, or even if you're a reasonably informed layman, you're saying, okay, well, what this person's telling me makes sense, and this person's got the expertise to talk about this. Well, then you'll go talk to expert B, and you'll hear a totally different thing. So one thing that gave me a lot of comfort when we were analyzing Joby, I heard across the board from everyone I spoke with, across all these various expert disciplines, this is far and away the leader. And so that's sort of the way to build the case itself as to what are you going to try to model. And then it becomes a function of time, obviously. What do you think the addressable market's going to look like? How is that going to expand over time? What do you think their market share is going to look like? How is that going to expand over time? And then obviously, importantly, what do the unit economics look like over time? And so when you start building out models with those various inputs, you come to say a 10-year or 15-year, whatever you're running set of cash flows, and most of the time the cash flows in the early years are going to be negative. So if you go back to Tesla, just take Tesla as an example. Tesla in 2013 into 2014, the market valuation went up by 6x. So you might say to yourself now with hindsight, oh, Tesla must have made a lot of vehicles and started making money in 2014. Well, the answer is they made 35,000 vehicles in 2014, and they burned about $350 million. And in fact, from 2014 to 2019, when the stock went up another 3x, they burned cumulatively almost $5 billion. So it wasn't a function of Tesla massively ramping production or Tesla massively ramping revenues in that time frame. It was a function of Tesla during that time frame putting out clear milestones to the market and hitting them. And in some cases, you hit those milestones late. SpaceX has a great line where they say, "We make the impossible late." So it's just a function of actually being able to achieve milestones, even if it's at a slightly extended timeline, and proving to the market that you're going to eventually get to where you're telling them that you're going to get. And then they can start to discount that in their own models, and therefore you can start to have meaningfully valuable companies that are not yet producing significant revenues, because the market's saying, I know they're not producing revenues today that are meaningful, but 5-10 years plus out, this is going to be a massive market. These guys are going to be the leaders or one of the leaders. They're going to have significant market share. S-curve is going to happen, so the cost of production is going to come down, and the unit economics are going to look tremendous. And if you believe my thesis on something like Joby, I believe Joby is not going to have a demand problem for a very, very long time, meaning that I think our constraint for the next several years is going to be supply. In other words, the number of aircraft we're producing per year.
Yeah, I got two more questions for you. One is, are you looking always for the top of class product or the top of class in an industry, or is there a perspective that there's also hidden gems amongst those emerging products, emerging industries? And if so, how do you identify them?
Well, so on the types of technology companies we've been talking about, my personal view is you have to try to pick the best one, for a lot of different reasons. There's going to be a timeline on things like certification or some kind of regulatory approval. There's going to be the capital question. The best companies can typically raise more capital than the other companies. The quality of the engineers becomes like a beautiful flywheel. Like great engineers can hire other great engineers. The founder is obviously incredibly important. I think having a technical founder for these types of businesses is an imperative for a lot of reasons. So if you're talking about those types of businesses, those types of companies, you have to try to pick the best one. And that doesn't mean it's going to be a monopoly or anything like that, but it means that again, going back to the physics piece, if the physics work is just probabilities, you just have a higher probability that you're going to have a profitable business over some time frame. There have been a lot of investments we've made over the years that don't have any of those qualities. So when we were doing a lot of bankruptcy investing, as I talked about at the very beginning, back in 08, 09, 010, we weren't necessarily looking for the best companies in an industry per se. We were looking for what I could describe as the best situations. So if you take something like Six Flags, for example, I'll just quickly go through that one because it's a totally different type of investing framework than what we've been talking about here on these technology businesses. So when Six Flags, let me just roll it back even further. Before Six Flags filed in June of 2009, filed for bankruptcy, they did an out-of-court restructuring in 2008. And essentially this happens a lot. They had a front-dated bond that was coming due that they were not going to be able to pay off. They weren't going to be able to refinance it. It was a difficult market in 2008. So they did an exchange offer. And basically, the holders of that front-dated bond, in exchange for higher priority, so basically they went up the capital structure, and a fatter coupon, they agreed to extend their maturity. And what that resulted in when the company filed in June of 2009 was you had essentially a three-tier capital structure. You had about $1.2 billion of bank debt. You had $400 million of this middle priority bond that was created through the exchange offer, and you had $868 million of junior bonds. And so we had a view as the first bonds we bought, it filed over the weekend. So the first bonds we bought that Monday were that middle priority bond, because that bond went from like 95 cents or something before they filed to 60 cents or even slightly below 60 cents after they filed. And our view was those bonds were covered. So it's really just a function of the bankruptcy process at that point, meaning it's covered from a valuation perspective. Over time, we became increasingly confident that all three tiers of bonds and bank debt were covered. And the junior bonds were trading at the time at like single digits, like 8 cents, 9 cents, something like that. So in the summer of 09, we started buying those junior bonds as well. And then we organized with some other funds into an ad hoc group, an ad hoc committee for the unofficial creditors group for those bonds. And so then it really became a process rather than an analysis. We were already confident that the value was sufficient to cover the entire cap structure. We knew we were going to have to raise a rights offering, and we knew we were going to have to raise new debt to take everyone ahead of us out so that we could own the equity. So, but we believe very strongly the value was there for that, and therefore we'd be able to raise that money. So then it was just a function of being able to navigate the bankruptcy court, navigate the process, navigate the fact that when you're an out of the money creditor, you're almost always going to be, at that moment in time, you're almost always going to be adverse with the management team. It's a very interesting thing. I used to say, the only time you will ever hear a CEO talk about how bad his company is in bankruptcy. And the reason for that is they're trying to talk down the value of the company because they want the more senior bonds to own the equity, because that means that their new equity package is going to be struck at a lower price. So we were able to, there's a long story. It took about a year, but we were able to navigate that. It ended up being a fantastic investment. But that's a very different type of investment, type of analysis, certainly type of process than investing in something like Joby or Oklo.
You've done so much and been involved in so many different projects, and you're long past the point of financial independence. What motivates you?
If you look at a lot of the things I'm working on now, and I've been, I'm not suggesting I coined the term, but I've been saying this term that's become a term that a lot of people use now, golden age. I've been saying golden age for a long time. I first started thinking about it in those terms, frankly, from this guy, Scott Adams, who you might follow on Twitter, who I think is amazing. I started reading his stuff way back in the summer of 2015 when he first started talking about Trump's persuasion powers and started making some incredibly valuable predictions. Maybe the best prediction I've ever read in my entire life. This would have been right after the first debate in 2015. This is when Jeb Bush was the front runner. This was your brain was in a very different place, at least mine was, then versus now. So this seemed even all the more shocking to read in that time period. He says, Donald Trump is going to break reality. And I was like, wow, that is a pretty bold prediction. But, depending on how you view the world, I think that a lot of that prediction has proven true. And so when I think about what does golden age actually mean, at least the way that I try to think about it, I think it means that going back to the 1970s, I was born in the 1970s. I mean, just take nuclear as just one example. I mentioned 133 to 2. That's the number of nuclear reactors we built prior to 78 and the number we've built since. So basically my entire life, and anyone that's roughly our age's life has been, there've been a lot of amazing advancements. Don't get me wrong. You got the iPhone, you've got things like Netflix, you've got all sorts of great things, advancements in certain medicines and medical treatment. Obviously, a lot of the things have improved, but a lot of things have tremendously stagnated. When I started really thinking about, really started, deeply thinking about something like SpaceX, when I started thinking about the lifetime implications of helping bring some of these technologies to reality and to market, that just really started to become exciting for me. You mentioned kids. It's exciting when you have kids even more. You start to think, oh, this will be cool. Like, the stuff we're working on today, if we're successful, is going to have not just financial implications, but it's going to have implications that are going to persist for decades and decades, and other things can be built off of them. It just becomes very exciting from that perspective. So those are some of the key motivations for me. And it's also like really inspiring to be around these teams. You meet with some of the top guys at Joby, some of the top engineers. And for someone like me, who's not a trained engineer, I think I have some, at least I hope I have some engineering tendencies or mindsets or what have you, but I have no formal training in it. So, being around these guys for extended periods of time, you almost start to have almost like an existential sort of thing. Like, what have I, what have I been able to do? Like, these guys can build all this stuff. Like, this is majorly impressive. So it's also sort of an inspirational thing to work on these projects and learn a lot about these things. These are highly complex technologies. There's a lot of, physics that frankly I haven't thought of in a long time. In some cases I've never even heard of. So it's like a constant learning wheel. So all of those things kind of make it very worthwhile in my view.
The big concern right now, I think, from the labor market is that automation is going to replace many of those jobs. And so there's a tremendous fear as we approach this. Does automation mean more prosperity for the average man, or does it mean that he is going to be taking a step back as his capabilities are surpassed by technology?
Well, speaking only from the perspective of America for the moment, a lot of this sort of prosperity has been a tremendous myth for the past several decades. If you're a working man, for example, your wages have stagnated when you adjust for inflation. A lot of these factory jobs have been shipped overseas. So a lot of that, to me, is just sort of a false narrative to begin with, for what it's worth. And the second thing I would say is, if you look historically, every time you've had substantial technology shifts, you have had certain jobs go away. Everyone loves to use the buggy whip example. You have had certain types of jobs go away, but the population of the country expanded significantly from, say, the 1870s till today. A tremendous number of new physical world technologies came online from call it 1870 to 1950, 1960. And so you have a tremendous number of jobs being displaced, and you also have a significantly growing population, and yet overall prosperity significantly accelerated for that time frame. Call it 1870, call it 1960. So a lot of the stagnation has been a function of some monetary policy mistakes, in my view, certainly the offshoring of a lot of our jobs. And so I think that this approach that this administration is taking for reindustrialization, deregulation, pushing these technologies not just forward in the laboratory, but also in the market, pushing forward this manufacturing scale up, all of those things will create a tremendous number of jobs. And I think, again, if you look at a technology like AI, sure, there's going to be a lot of companies. I mean, we looked at a company, my friend and I'm working with him on his AI business, and we're looking at building it in this certain angle, and there's a publicly traded competitor to the same general type of business model, and this is about a $10 billion market cap company. And we were saying, not being facetious, you could probably, if that company didn't exist, you could probably replicate that company today with like 10, maybe 15% of the headcount. You could just do so much more with agentic AI than you would need humans for. So a lot of those types of jobs will be displaced, but those same tools that are displacing those jobs will make so many other modes of life and modes of work tremendously more productive and frankly rewarding, because it's going to take a lot of the sort of rote pieces of work in life out of the equation or significantly reduce them. So when it comes to these things, I'm not saying it's not a threat. I'm not saying it's not a risk. I'm not saying bad things can happen, but I tend to take a very optimistic view that's informed by history. And I try to take a realistic view of where we actually are today. In other words, is it really that great today in terms of these physical world technologies that that we shouldn't pursue these things? And then there's the other overarching view that we talked about. China's going to do it. China is doing it. So in my view, we have to figure these things out along the way, but we don't have a choice as to whether or not we do them. Well,
Michael, thank you so much. You brought some rays of brilliance today, and I hope that the listeners can leverage that as they approach the investment markets of the future. And thank you so much, and we will be talking to you again soon, I hope.
I look forward to it, and thanks for having me. It's been great. Talk to you soon.